Good morning, maybe afternoon, close. I'm John Kennedy. I'm pleased to serve as the moderator of this panel. I'm a professor of communication, former Boston Globe reporter. I'm also a resident of the Vineyard. This is a discussion about two fascinating books that have been released about the notorious gangster James Joseph Bulger, Jr., as we know him as Whitey. As we speak, the trial of Whitey Bulger is winding down in federal court in Boston, and it is expected to go to the jury next week. Correct?
Yeah. Tuesday.
Yep, Tuesday. In that case, Bulger is accused of 19 murders during his long-running reign of terror in Boston. These books tell the story of a man. Let's just call him a gangster, shall we?
I think we can do that.
We can do that? Good.
Kevin's called him a lot of other things, too.
He's called us worse.
We'll get to that. He corrupted the FBI and received its protection while he went about commanding Boston's underworld for many, many years. That protection also included a tip-off about his indictment that allowed him to escape arrest and go into hiding for nearly 17 years before he was finally captured in 2011. Let me introduce the authors, three of America's finest journalists today, and then allow them each to speak about a particular area of interest. I'll ask them a few questions after that, and then most importantly, we'll open it up to you folks for questions. On my far left is Dick Lehr.
Not politically.
Not
politically.
On my far left is Dick Lehr, professor of journalism at Boston University and the co-author with Jerry O'Neill of Whitey, the life of America's most notorious mob boss. He and Jerry also co-authored an earlier book called Black Mass, which won the Edgar Award, and it first plumbed this relationship between Whitey and the FBI. He's a former Boston Globe reporter, where he was a member of the Globe Spotlight team, winner of numerous journalism awards, and was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize in investigative reporting. Shelley Murphy is co-author of Whitey Bulger. I'll hold that one up for you. Some of you have already bought the book. America's Most Wanted Gangster and the Manhunt That Brought Him to Justice. She has been a reporter at the Globe since 1993,
10 years at the Herald before that.
10 years at the Herald, and before that, the Portland paper. She's covered criminal justice, legal affairs, homeland security, and organized crime, including the twists and turns of Whitey Bulger's life over the years. She is also the winner of the George Polk Award for Metropolitan Reporting. And finally, Kevin Cullen, who co-authored Whitey Bulger with Shelley. He's a Boston Globe columnist and reporter. He's a member of the 2003 investigative team that won the Pulitzer Prize for the coverage of the Catholic Church's sexual abuse scandal. He specializes in writing about ordinary people and has twice won the Frank Batten Medal for inspiring storytelling. He's worked at the Globe since 1985, and his reporting on Whitey goes back further than that. And he also lived in South Boston during a long period of Whitey's career. So I'm going to ask Kevin to start a little bit and talk about a character in the book that is actually not a person. It's a place, South Boston, where Whitey grew up and never strayed too far until he was on the lam, right?
No, that's South Boston is a character in the book because to understand Whitey, you have to place him in a context of time and place. And Shelley and I, when we were doing this, we were trying to figure out, is there any other place in America where this could have happened? Could this have happened in Philadelphia? Could it have happened in Hell's Kitchen in New York? Could it have happened in San Francisco, Chicago? And we came to the conclusion it could not, because one of the intriguing things about this is that the FBI decided their national policy was going to take out the mafia. Problem with national policies is they don't take into account regional differences. And in Boston, Boston was the only place where you had an organized crime structure in which the Irish were just as bad and as big and as lethal as the mafia. And so the beginning of that premise, going to guys like Bulger and make them the rats to get the mafia, that was flawed and necessarily corrupt from the get-go. But the thing about Whitey and Billy and the idea of these two, angels with dirty faces characters coming out of the same household in South Boston, that was not unusual for that milieu, that time, that place. Kevin O'Neill, who was Whitey's henchman, two of his brothers, Kevin Weeks, two of his brothers went to Harvard. And Billy became a lawyer, Jackie became a political consultant, and very infamously was the one who told Mike Dukakis to get in that tank and put that hat on his head. So, as I once said to Kevin, I said, you were involved in the killings of human beings. Jackie only killed the campaign. So, but if you look at those, and they grew up in a different time period, and they grew up across the street. The Weeks family came from the old Connolly project. The Bulgers came from the old Harbor project, but you had the similar situation. And one of the things that Kevin told Shelley and I that I thought was so revealing, his father was prouder of Kevin being Whitey's henchman than he was of the two sons that went to Harvard. So that is the kind of place South Boston was. That is the kind of place where Whitey would have come out of there. And the idea of being a gangster, aspiring to be a gangster was, as lofty an ideal in some places in Southie as being like Billy Bulger, aspiring to be a triple eagle, going to Boston College High, Boston College Law School. And so we tried to capture that and one of the advantages we had of doing this is that it was, my whole maternal side is from South Boston. My mother was born there. She was in the first graduating class at Gate of Heaven, 1938, Gate of Heaven High School. And only in Southie would the term, a church and a parish and a high school named Gate of Heaven be reduced to Gatey. That's what they call it. They call it Gatey. And I, as a child, spent most of my summers with my cousins on East Broadway and or my aunt on East 2nd Street. And every Sunday we drove over to South Boston when my mother and my Aunt Mary would tell the same 4 stories over and over and over again. And I remember we were going over the Northern Avenue Bridge, which is right where the courthouse is now, where Whitey's being tried. And my father would turn to us, all the kids in the back seat of the Impala, and say, "Watch this, kids. Now, watch how your mother changes." Because when she went to Southie, she was back in the day, as they said. And so I kind of had that background. Somebody asked me once, a reporter doing a thing about Shelley and I, and he said, "When was the first time you were aware of Whitey Bulger?" And I had to sit and think about it. And I said, probably when I was like a teenager. You learned about, if you had any connection to South Boston, you learned about Whitey by osmosis. And at some point, I was aware that he was a gangster. He was a guy whose name you're not supposed to drop in public. And then when my wife and I lived there, and actually, this is the other class, and I'll end with this Southie tidbit. I blame Mr. Lehr at the other end of the table on this one. Dick and I were on the original team that in 1988 exposed him as an informant. And Dick, we had this idea that one of the pieces of corroborating evidence we had for this is that Whitey got pulled out of an indictment, which all the Winter Hill guys were going, and that to us said, they protected him. He's a rat. And so Dick sent a letter to Tony Chilla, who was the gangster who was at the head of this race fix scam that they were running. And so then the FBI agent, Tom Daly, who handles Chilla, calls the Globe, and I'm the only one in the office at the time, so I pick up the phone. He goes, "I know what you guys are working on. It's not true. Bulger's not an informant. And if you put that in the paper, he'd think nothing of clipping you." And he said, "Especially you, Kevin, because you live there." So after I changed my pants, I went in to Jerry O'Neill, who's our editor and Dick's co-author, and I told Jerry what happened. He said, "Go out there and write a contemporaneous memo about recall the conversation as best as you could and can." So anyway, we have a bunch of meetings after this, and we figure if there's really a threat the FBI would do a much more formal notification process. And we knew this because we had actually worked on, Dick, Jerry, and I and Chris Chinlin had worked on a Mafia series just like 2 years earlier about, and the FBI was notifying like criminals that they were going to get hit. So we assumed that if a reporter was going to get hit, there'd be a more formal notification process. But just to be safe, right before we published, the Globe decided that my wife Martha and I should relocate from our home in South Boston. But this is so Boston. We moved 9 stops away on the Red Line. We moved to Harvard Square. I said,
Well, given
that
how the Red Line
never-
works, you know.
they would never find us in Harvard Square. I'm done.
Thanks, Kevin. So, Shelley, you've been doing the dailies for the Globe on the trial every day,
Yes?
and the big event yesterday was the fact that Whitey indicated that he will not, in fact, testify.
That's right.
Despite his lawyer's assertions early on, Whitey's going to tell a story, he's going to tell a story, he's going to tell a story. So we looked to other areas where Whitey has spoken, and you happen to get access to some letters from one of his old buddies in Alcatraz and Atlanta Penitentiary.
Right.
And tell us a little bit about his voice in those.
Well, the letters are really fascinating. After Whitey was captured, he did start writing to Richard Sunday. And these letters really revealed to us that while Whitey has many problems, self-esteem is definitely not one of them. He has a very high opinion of himself. And in these letters, it was really interesting to see that he takes no responsibility for anything that he's charged with. He blames the government. He feels that he is this poor guy who's been persecuted. And one of the things that was interesting, for example, he was on the run for 16 years with his longtime girlfriend, Kathy Gregg. He described it not as a man on the run, but as a 16-year honeymoon. And he described her as the love of his life and said if he had only met her earlier, life might have been different. Now, that kind of ignores the fact that many of the 19 murders he's accused of committing, he was seeing Kathy at the time, so she apparently didn't have as great of influence as we would have hoped. But in the letters, he says that he's furious at the government. How dare the government indict Kathy. Now, Kathy, as some of you may know, was sentenced to 8 years in prison a year ago for helping him evade capture. She was the one, while Whitey was sort of hunkered down in their little rent-controlled apartment a couple of blocks from the beach in Santa Monica, she was the one going to fill his prescriptions and doing the shopping and paying the bills and just this lovely woman that all of the neighbors adored. And so she was sentenced to 8 years in prison. And Whitey says in these letters, well, how dare they? They should be giving her a medal. She did what no law enforcement person could do. That was keep me crime-free for 16 years.
If you don't take into account the 30 guns in his
Yeah,
wall.
so they did find 30 guns in the walls of the apartment, but hey, he says everybody needs a hobby, and his was collecting guns. So the letters really do, though. One thing that the letters showed us is that we knew before his trial began in June that the two things that he most wanted to refute at this trial was that I was never an FBI informant. Now, there is a pretty hefty FBI file that suggests he was. I was never an FBI informant, and I did not kill those 2 women. He's charged, with killing 2 women along with, 17 other people. And those are the 2 things that meant the most to him. And the reason is that Whitey, reputation is everything. And he spent a lifetime trying to cultivate this reputation as being a good bad guy, a gangster with scruples. And we've seen this unfold during this trial. Throughout the trial, he has spent more time with this reputation defense, there's no issue on the verdict. The jury will not be looking at whether he was or wasn't an informant. There's nothing on that verdict slip that you can check for that. But that is where he has devoted most of his attention. One of the most interesting things I thought about this trial, the one surprise, was that in opening statements, right away, his lawyer admitted that he was a drug dealer, that he was not only, he had cultivated this reputation over the years as a guy who kept the drugs out of Southie. And now we know, not only did he not keep them out, he brought them in. He was part of this drug ring that was bringing in marijuana and cocaine. But Whitey has still managed to try to convince the jury that there was something noble about that, because you know what? He says he drew the line at angel dust and heroin.
What a guy.
What a guy.
What a stand-up guy.
But anyway, on that note, I know we
Okay.
want to leave it open for a lot of questions, and we want Dick to have a chance.
Well, I will ask Dick to talk about that code that among gangsters that there is honor among thieves, that you're not a rat.
Yeah.
So explore that a little bit for us. How far back that goes.
Yeah, no, and as Shelley was saying, that the defense that Whitey was presenting at trial through his lawyers, who were pretty much channeling Whitey Bulger in their statements, it became clear to all of us that it wasn't so much a legal defense, it was almost quasi-political defense, as Shelley called it. It's been called different things: a reputation defense, a legacy defense, a vanity defense. It was all about image and stuff like that. And that he's not an informant. And in writing his biography with Jerry O'Neill and researching his life, one of the revelatory things that we got into once we got a hold for the first time of his vast prison file for the 9 years he was in federal prison. And this is the kind of thing he would have had to face if he had taken the stand on cross-examination, was that he'd been an informant once before, not just the 2 decades with the FBI, but as a young bank robber in 1956, after he had been captured for several bank robberies that he committed, not just in Massachusetts, but in Rhode Island and also in Hammond, Indiana. He was facing some really hard time. And what had happened to him was that he had been ratted out by some of his fellow bank robbers. So suddenly at age 26, or 25, turning 26, I think, he's facing some real hard time, bank robberies in 3 states. And so what does he do? This information was in the new records, or the records in his prison file. He ratted on 2 of the bank robbers who had not yet been captured. There was Richard Barshard, and there was William O'Brien, who had done the job in Indiana and in Melrose, Massachusetts. And it was sort of buried in his prison file, and he wouldn't reduce it to writing. The FBI reports talked about how he only talked about it orally. He had at that time, I think it's uncanny or eerie that his girlfriend at the time, a woman named Jackie McAuliffe, seemed to be, Kathy Gregg back 40-something years.
Like the blondes.
God, yeah. And she had been with him on the bank robbery in Indiana and been with him on the run. And so these records show that he persuaded her to cooperate in giving them the kind of information they needed so they could arrest both O'Brien and Richard Barshard. And so there it was. I mean, this guy's done it before. And the lesson learned for him, the way we looked at it, the takeaway that would serve him, in the years to come when he cut his deal with the FBI, is that it's better to be a rat than to be ratted on. And I think that's the kind of calculation that he made over time, that you saw early on. And that's the fascinating thing about, researching his life story. I mean, this guy's been around a long time. He's turning 84?
Next month.
Next month?
September.
I'm going to send him a cake.
Yeah. He was born in 1929, a few weeks before the stock market crash. So you start looking in his life, and you're basically taking a ride through the 20th century, going through all these interesting doors and whatnot. And I think one of the things that gets us going as journalists, and I think we do it in both our books, is debunking the Bulger myths, whether it's Whitey or the family stories. And the one that comes to mind, again, goes back in time. If maybe some of you have read Bill Bulger's memoir, and his account of how their father lost an arm at age 15. It's a tragic story no matter how it happened, losing your arm at 15. But Bill Bulger's rendering is this notion, this myth, that his father at 15 was working in the Navy Yard in Charlestown, trying to bring home food for, the poor family at home. I mean, it's compelling and whatnot. Well, the truth of the matter is, when you're really digging into the full story of Whitey's life, is that the father at age 15 was a runaway, much like the son would be, fast forward. And he was in Providence, Rhode Island, trying to jump a freight train when he fell between 2 cars and crushed his arm that then had to be amputated. Very different tone and texture than the one that Bill Bulger would like us to believe about his family history and whatnot. Anyway, I'll stop there, and we'll open it up.
Keep going. Yeah. Let me ask all of you, it seems to me that Whitey Bulger hasn't done this alone. He's had friends in high places all his life, right? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that. Not just his brother, who maybe arguably was the most powerful
When we
Massachusetts
get into
politician.
these situations, we're almost invariably asked, what about Billy? What did Billy know? What do you think about Billy? I came away from it viewing Billy as an enabler. And that, I mean, I've had a lot of conversations with Billy over the years. He would not cooperate with us in our book, and obviously he wouldn't cooperate with Dick and Jerry. And I looked at Billy as a guy that invested, so he really believed his brother was going to go straight. Billy was a young law student when Whitey went away. And then he spent, while he's a law student, he's basically becomes almost Whitey's advocate. He becomes, for lack of a better term, his lawyer. And he's out there trying to assemble. So he gets Bob Drinan, who was then the dean of the law school, a Jesuit priest who you probably remember later became a congressman and was the first congressman to call for Richard Nixon's impeachment. Drinan becomes not only his spiritual advisor, but he literally agrees to become his parole advisor. He was basically vouching for Whitey on parole. Billy also got the Speaker of the House at this point, by 1960, John McCormick. And the only reason everybody identifies the Bulgers as being South Boston people. I always say, if you want to blame one person for foisting Whitey on South Boston, blame FDR. Because FDR, part of his New Deal was public housing. And one of the young congressmen in the 30s who helped sell the New Deal to a very cynical American public was a young and up-and-coming guy from Southie named John McCormick. And part of the deal, the quid pro quo, was that first housing project goes in Southie. And the Bulger family had lived in Dorchester. Whitey was actually born in Everett, just north of Boston. And they lived in Dorchester. They were kicking around in different cold water flats, and then they were poor enough. They had 6 kids. They ended up, oh no, Jackie was born after, right? Jackie and Jean. So
Youngest,
I think they had 5
5
kids. And so they were poor enough to go on the project. And then Whitey grows up there. So Billy does all this political wheeling and dealing to help Whitey get out of parole. And I remember at one point while we were doing the research, Shelley turned to me and she was reading letters that Whitey had sent from prison to Bill. And this sort of, as Shelley said, she goes, if you read this and you didn't know who we're talking about, you'd really be pulling for this guy. Because he talks about being the black sheep of his family, how he embarrassed his family, and he never wanted to do that again. He wanted to get out, he wanted to go straight, he wanted to make them proud of him and all this stuff. And what we found is when he got out of the can, he worked for about a year in a construction job. And he basically said, screw this, I'm not getting up at 7 in the morning. And he was lazy. If you look at his criminal career, Whitey was lazy. He would kill people and then make his minions bury them. And he'd go upstairs and take a nap. So, I mean, there's a recurring theme about that, and I think Billy was so heavily invested in getting him out and put his reputation on the right, that Billy could never admit how bad he was. I sat with Billy many times. He told me, you keep putting in, because by the mid-'80s, I started writing about Whitey and drugs, first for the Herald, then for the Globe. Because all the DEA guys and the state cops would tell him, he's all involved in drugs. He has people out there selling drugs. And Billy Bulger on several occasions confronted me and said, once when I was just walking around Castle Island with my wife, you keep putting that in the paper, it's not true, you're taking, the state police hate my brother, they hate me. Everything at the Bulgers was about a persecution complex. And you could see that, I think Billy could not admit how bad his brother is because that would almost reflect back on him, that he was the one. And the one thing, like I said, I think people sometimes when they say Billy should have turned him in or you should have helped find him and all this stuff, I don't know what I'd do. My brother Joe is a lovely guy. I don't think he'd ever become a serial killer. But if he did, would I turn him in? Would I go out of my, I don't know. I can't say that. But I do think that Billy enabled Whitey. And what we'll never be able to figure out, one of those great, we always say, what happens if Michael Collins lives? What happens if Jack Kennedy lived? What happens if Billy Bulger turns to his brother in 1965 or 66 when we know he goes back into the life, and he says, as long as you're in that life, you can't be in mine. Because Whitey needed and wanted and thrived on the succor of his family, the support of his family. He wanted to be there on Christmas Day. He wanted to see his nieces and nephews. That made him feel, that allowed Whitey to say, I'm not such a scumbag. I am not a psychopath. I have loving relationships with my families. My nieces and nephews love me. So Billy doesn't push his gangster brother away. He names one of his sons after him. So I think that's, and like I said, I don't like being judgmental on that kind of stuff. Families are weird, and I wouldn't want anybody doing a book on my family. But at the same time, that's about where I came away from the project believing that Billy was an enabler of his brother.
Well,
if I
yeah,
jump in
please.
briefly, I think what you see from examining the records involving the family and Bill is that when Whitey goes away to prison in 1956, Bill Bulger does emerge what we call as Whitey's advocate-in-chief. It's not their father, it's not their mother, it's not the oldest sister. It's Bill Bulger, and that sets a theme that becomes, I think, lifelong. And I think what's really fascinating is, after Whitey goes on the run in 1995, and we have a chapter near the end of our book called Band of Brothers, because pulling together a lot of information that had come out of various trials and whatnot. But I think it's astonishing that even at that point in time, that how much contact Whitey on the run with Kathy Gregg has with his family back in Boston, mainly Jack, his brother Jack, but also through Jack to Bill, updates, reports, all that kind of stuff while he's trying to find his sea legs out on the run those first 2 years. That's kind of eye-popping to realize. I mean, that it's out now. Whitey's a killer. He's an informant, and he's on the run. All that stuff's out there, and the family ties are really tight. And then you overlap. I know and it's interesting to sometimes do this as authors is realize an overlapping chronology. In the fall of '96, during this time that I'm just discussing, that's the time that one Kaczynski brother realized that the other was the Unabomber, and he was making a choice that for the greater good in public safety, he had to do that. Well, you put those storylines and chronologies together, and the Bulgers went in a different direction.
Let me ask you one other question, then I'll open it up to all you folks, because I know you've got probably better questions than I have. But I think there's one key character here that that's very important to this story. It makes it an amazing story, is the fact that a young man who grew up in the projects with the Bulger brothers later became an FBI agent who was critical in Whitey's success. John Connolly.
Well, John Connolly, I mean, I have to say, I mean, I knew him when he was still, a star in the FBI's Boston office. He was considered as I think Steve Flemmi described him as big man on campus. He was the one agent who developed more sources in the FBI's Boston office than any other. And I think John Connolly is a really tragic figure in this. Because, if you look at John Connolly, I'm not saying that John Connolly's not guilty. There was overwhelming evidence that he is the guy who leaked information to Whitey. You're about to be indicted in late 1994. It allowed Whitey to get away and be on the run for 16 years. But while he's gone and the story is unfolding back in Boston, John Connolly is indicted in 2002. He's convicted in 2002, sent to prison for 10 years on an obstruction of justice charge and racketeering. Then he's indicted in Miami on a charge of leaking information to Whitey Bulger that prompted them to actually murder a Boston businessman that they viewed as a potential witness who could have implicated Whitey in murder. So John Connolly goes to trial in Miami. He's convicted in that case. He's now serving a 40-year sentence. He's always maintained his innocence, and as I said, the evidence is pretty overwhelming. But it's really, to me, a travesty that there's been so much FBI corruption detailed in court, and the federal government has said, well, the statute of limitations has run. It's too late to charge any of these other agents accused of taking bribes, leaking information. So John Connolly is the only guy. One other FBI agent was charged and died while awaiting trial, but John Connolly is the only FBI agent to ever go to trial on this matter. And so he's been the scapegoat for the entire scandal that, and it certainly was a scandal. And now John's sitting there in Miami, and he's always maintained his innocence. I interviewed him in prison after his conviction down in Miami. If they ever get Whitey, we're going to learn the truth. He's going to vindicate me and, everything. I'm going to go free. And then Whitey finally gets caught, and Whitey does not take the stand, but he says, not only was I never an FBI informant, John Connolly was so corrupt, he fabricated my entire informant file.
Thanks,
So it's like John is getting it from every end. So I really do feel that he's been the convenient scapegoat. The government has wanted to say, and this is one of the biggest travesties in the whole case to me, and is that, so now you have the government. They've cut all these deals with these bad guys. John Martirano killed 20 people, served 12 years, and he's free, walking around. You have, Kevin Weeks, participated in 5 murders. He served 5 years. Corrupt FBI agent John Morris got immunity, never served a day. So you have all these, Flemmy, the only one, he's serving life, evaded the death penalty. So you have all these deals. But when the families start hearing, the families of the victims start hearing how, the FBI really had a hand in a lot of these murders, that Connolly, has been convicted of leaking information that led to murder. Families finally get their day in court. They finally sue. And the government fights the cases tooth and nail, and they manage to get most of them dismissed, so the families never get their day in court in these civil cases, not on the grounds that they were wrong. They were right. You should have known sooner. There was so much evidence of corruption. You should have known the FBI was to blame, and you just waited too long. Case dismissed. And that's what happened to most of them. A few of them that made it to trial, they won. They won judgments against the government, but very few made it. So I do think that John is this really, he grew up in Southie. He was an FBI agent. Billy was his mentor, Billy Bulger. And we now know from what unfolded in court is that he protected Whitey because Whitey, he wanted to protect the Bulger name, the Bulger family, and he has paid the ultimate price, but he's the only one that's really, in the government that's ever been held accountable.
Unbelievable.
Dick?
Yeah, I was, I think that Whitey turned on John Connolly, who has remained so loyal to the Bulgers and to Whitey Bulger all these years, is some of the final evidence, not that we need it anymore, about how Whitey is this supreme narcissist, this psychopath. It's always all about him. And suddenly it became this reputation thing. I wasn't an informant. And this guy, John Connolly, who's been doing everything for him for so many years, who enabled and protected him on the streets of Boston and tried to defend him after he was on the run, he just throws him under the bus, to use that cliche. He's a piece of tissue to throw away. And I just think, what climactic better evidence do we need about, this monster named Whitey Bulger? And as far as Connolly being, the scapegoat, to me, one of the biggest concerns we should all have, and I think earlier on, Whitey Bulger obviously has sort of marquee status in terms of his name. But it's really the FBI that should concern us all, okay? And that's what distinguishes Whitey Bulger and puts him in a league of his own, because you can't say his name without in the same breath mentioning the FBI. The FBI, in our early work in Black Mass, Whitey Bulger didn't even make the title of the book. It was about, it was journalistically, it was the public agency, the corruption, the abuse of power and not just in a single case, but as a way of life, a culture in Boston that had caused so much harm. That's the ongoing concern I think that we should all have, and I don't think we've gotten a full accounting, even though at various times along the way, there was a special prosecutor from Connecticut named John Durham, who we all thought was going to issue some kind of report, even if there was no criminal charges. But after Whitey's capture, and I don't know if you had this experience, after Whitey's capture, institutionally, the FBI just is so PR conscious and so protective. I was on some media thing doing some commentary with some retired FBI guy, and talking about this FBI scandal of historic proportion, he referred to the problem as being 2 bad apples, Connolly and his supervisor Morris. And this is 2011. That is so old and so been toppled so many years ago. But here we are in 2011. The FBI is still worried about its reputation, its image and whatnot, and trying to minimize what this is all about. As we're a wonderful agency, and we had 2 bad apples, but don't let broad brush. I called him on it. I said, give me a break. That may have worked in 1990, but this is 2011. But that's what they go to, and I think that's what we all have to be,
I
on
couldn't
guard
agree
for.
with Dick more on this, that and this is this has come up at some of our book events, but if people ask, do you think the FBI learned their lesson? I say no. I don't think the FBI's culture has changed one iota. 2 years ago, I wrote a column about a guy named Mark Rossetti. Mark Rossetti was a gangster that the FBI recruited as an informant. And when the Massachusetts State Police decided to go after him, a state cop I know called the FBI and the supervisor on their squad and said, listen, on the OC squad, and said, we're going to make a move on Rossetti. We're pretty sure he's one of your guys. And the FBI agent said, oh, absolutely not. He's not one of our guys. Oh, no, no, no. So the state police put the wire up. The very first conversation they record of Mark Rossetti, he's talking to his FBI handler. And he says, the Stadies are coming after me. And so anyway, when they make the arrest, after a long investigation, the guy I know in the state police got a call from that FBI supervisor. He goes, hey, that's a great pinch. You want to roll them together? And the state cop told me, he went like this, roll them? We're going to put him in prison. He's a murderer. You know he's been involved in at least 6 homicides. And he said the FBI agent's response was, well, we know of only 1. So 1 was acceptable. But what it shows is that, I remember Bob Mueller, who just left as the FBI director, he was there for 12 years, I believe, told Shelley at one point, I don't know, was it about 7 or 8 years ago, he referred to Bulger as ancient history. And that pisses me off when I hear them say that, because as Dick say, they have never given a full accounting. John Durham, who promised us he would tell us all about what happened. He made that promise in 2002 that he would issue a report that would identify other FBI agents that were corrupted by Whitey Bulger. Well, I'm glad I didn't hold my breath waiting for that report, because I would die. It never came out. And
So
then
what
John
happened?
Durham,
Why didn't he?
well, John
What
Durham, I
happened?
guess, had to go on and protect and cover up for the CIA after that, because he went on to, he was the one that investigated the guys that were torturing suspects.
Well, we did find out, in fact, one of the things that they said at the time, this was in 2002, is that, we will do a full report, but the statute of limitations has told it's too late to indict any more agents unless they were involved in murder.
Convenient.
And what Kevin and I found while doing our book is that, and it came out at trial, we had first reported it in the book, but one FBI agent, according to Bulger's associates, gave them C4 explosives, which they put on a boat and sent to the IRA. And that agent was never questioned about it because it was too late to bring charges. And I interviewed him, and he said, that's not true. I never gave them C4. I wouldn't have access to C4. And I said, you act so surprised. I mean, certainly you were interviewed about this. And he said, no, you're the first one to call me about it. So,
Well, let's open it up to you folks. Any questions? Yes, in the back?
Question for Kevin, and the distinction of an enabler instead of accomplice. How do you
Well, I mean, an enabler, like I said, I use that word to say that when you enable somebody, you tolerate behavior, you don't call them out on it. An accomplice, I mean, I guess we might even be getting into legal terms. An accomplice would be somebody who actually assists you in the commission of crimes. I don't have evidence that Billy Bulger, assisted in the commission of crimes. I'm saying that when I came away from this process believing that he may have been able to get his brother to stop crime if he said, you can't be part of our family if you're in that life. That's when I say he's an enabler. And I say that also through the years when he's coming up to people like all of us and saying, oh, my brother's not that bad. And then everything, like I said, when we would say, why would people say that your brother's a murderer if he's not a murderer? His response would be, that's to get us, to get the Bulger family. Their sense of persecution is enormous. I mean,
And-
Whitey said Whitey said yesterday he tried to portray himself as a victim of prosecution complex. I would say he's a victim of persecution complex.
I tell you what, it turns out we only have a few more minutes, so I'd like to get at least a couple more questions very, very, very quickly. Yes?
Why does Whitey say that he had immunity from the federal government, in terms of being charged with these murders? Isn't that what he claimed?
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think that is obviously a legal term. But I think if you take away that term, the legal term immunity. You have to try to put yourself in his shoes, which I don't encourage anyone to really do. But starting in the mid-'70s, he experienced what on the street would be called, you could call protection. He got away with it. He had FBI agents actually telling him who to kill in order to. So he experienced this sense of being an untouchable, being protected, being, quote, immune from prosecution. That's his adult life crime boss gangster experience. So in a weird, perverse way, he's saying what he knows, what he knows and what he experiences. That doesn't make it lawful. That doesn't make it a legitimate legal defense.
Right.
That's what he just enjoyed.
Well, yeah, he actually, his defense was a little different. When Steve Flemmi, his associate, went on trial, he tried to get the case dismissed, saying he had immunity from an FBI agent who promised him, we won't prosecute you as long as you don't, there was a caveat, as long as you don't kill anyone. Bulger took it one step further. He claimed that a federal prosecutor who is now dead promised him back probably around late 70s, early 80s, and Whitey never really gave any details. That was part of his problem. He never had any, support for it. But he claimed this former prosecutor who was targeting the mafia promised him that he had immunity past, future, unexpired, for everything, including murder. And the reporters were all saying, well, but you're not an informant, so why would they give you immunity? They just really liked you, And so what he claimed is that, and this was just yesterday when he stood up in court and decided not to testify, he said he saved the prosecutor's life. For protecting his life, he gave me immunity. So, how credible
One
do you
last
think that
one.
is?
I'm sorry, we don't have as much time as I thought we had. I'm sorry.
In your introduction, you said Whitey corrupted the FBI. Maybe you misspoke, but clearly what is coming out is that they didn't need Whitey Bulger evidently to be corrupted.
It's symbiotic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Two.
What really, you mentioned the protecting, Connolly interested in protecting the Bulger reputation. Does that explain it, or is there some other way of explaining the institutional corruption of the FBI? And on the informant defense, is that maybe not him anticipating being in prison again, and the only thing he can possibly get out of this trial is going into prison, having, said he's not an informant, because you don't do very well in prison if you're in.
You don't.
Well, he's
Or a
already,
scanner.
we've already seen his entire informant file, and it's filled with information that only could have come from Whitey. So that defense is, kind of gone by the books there. But in terms of, the whole idea that, I think that in terms of your first question, Kevin, what would you say?
What?
What
What
was
is
your
that
first
for-
question?
could you repeat the question?
You asked 5 questions. I'm like, wait a minute, there was one I
There
was
are a
going to
few
answer.
questions there.
What explains the corruption?
The corruption, like I said,
The FBI's.
the Connolly stuff was very peculiar to Southie and stuff. But you begin with the premise that the reason Connolly could get away with it is because the FBI would never question, oh yeah, we protect murderers all the time.
was the
You get
culture.
promoted in the FBI not by making cases, but by making informants. You roll people. That's what you do. You have informants. You're only as good as your informants. And then the FBI is very selective in what, they're not like, the cops find a body, they got to prosecute. The FBI decides what they're going to do. And so, they think it's cool. They called it the top echelon program. So they want to get the highest they can. The problem with that, when you're protected, particularly, I don't think Bulger was useful as an informant at all. I did agree with that part of his defense, and I agreed with Bobby Fitzpatrick, who tried to, recommend to close him out. But that said, even if you accept that Whitey was an informant, by 1983, the mafia had been taken off the street. He and Flemmi were the undisputed kings of crime in Boston, and yet the FBI protected them. And I think they protected them at that point is because they had so much. Stevie and Whitey could have really implicated the FBI in a lot. So their corruption caught up to them. Connolly just manipulated it for his own ends.
And the manipulation was he made it appear on paper that Whitey was a valuable informant against the mafia, and the FBI's #1 priority nationwide was take out the mafia, and they never took into account regional differences in a city like Boston, where Whitey's gang was equally powerful. And so, by touting Whitey as this, informant against the mafia, even though we don't really believe he was that valuable against the mafia, But he made him appear that way, and it allowed them to put him under that umbrella of protection.
Let's
We gotta
thank
go.
these three great authors. Thank you, people.